Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's Tracked Live event. Today, we are going to be going over some baking basics and starting you guys all there at home on your very own journey to a quarantine bread baking success story. And so today we're going to be walking all of you there at home how to make your very own sourdough starter. And today I'm going to be teaching Miranda through these steps while you guys follow along at home. And so my name is Kimi.
I'm Miranda.
And we're going to go ahead and get started. So in case you guys don't have your materials ready, we're just going to briefly go over them so you guys can go ahead and collect them right now. What you're going to need in terms of ingredients are two simple things, some simple water, and you're going to need some flour. And that flour can be all purpose, it can be whole wheat, it can be rye, whatever you have on hand. It's just going to make your bread loaf that much more unique. As for utensils and mixing materials, what you're going to need is a clear bowl or jar to store your starter in, a mixing spoon / spatula, anything just to combine your ingredients. And then you're going to need some rubber band, tape, or cling wrap to cover the top. And then lastly, you're going to need something to measure out your ingredients. And so for some of you guys at home might have a fancy kitchen scale like I have here. And for others, that might be some mixing, some measuring cups instead. And so that's what Miranda will be using today. And I think the most useful is going to be a 1/3 cup. So while you guys go ahead and collect those materials, we are just going to go ahead and give a little intro about ourselves. So my name is Kimi. I'm a junior, and some of my passions evidently include bread baking, which I picked up during quarantine. I'm also an avid gardener. I love to stargaze, and I just generally have a really big passion about learning about things around me. And what about you, Miranda?
All right, hi, everyone. I'm Miranda. I think we have a lot of really common interests, Kimmy. I definitely got into baking a lot during quarantine. Also, plant care. I have a ton of houseplants. I would say almost too many. And I also enjoy skateboarding. I can only go in a straight line, but that's enough for me.
Very nice. And so what is your experience with bread? What have you done in the past?
Honestly, I don't think I've baked bread with yeast in a really long time, which is why I'm sort of excited to get into it today. I've made like 6 loaves of banana bread over quarantine, but you actually don't need any yeast for that. What about you?
Yeah, I mostly got into it because my mom was really into bread making at the beginning, so I just sort of watched her from afar, but then I realized it's actually super cool and I decided to try it for myself. And that's basically how I got into it. And I know that we both have a love for science. We even had the same science teacher. And I think it's just so cool how bio is just so applicable, and bio and chemistry. And bread is one of the perfect examples of that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I know you created a path for Track today. What was that about?
Yeah, so the reason that I wanted to make the path was sort of because I got really into baking during quarantine. And a lot of people say that baking is a science, sort of as a joke, because there's like a lot of measuring and it's very exact and there's a lot of experimentation involved, which I'm sure you know. But what really interested me was sort of the chemical and biological processes behind baking bread, which is why I decided to look into yeast microorganisms and sort of the chemical processes behind baking a loaf of bread.
Awesome. That's so cool. So hopefully all of you at home have had time to collect some of your materials, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start off with a general question just for the chat. Do you guys know what a starter is? Have you heard of yeast starter? Do you know its role in bread? Just basically give us any background info that you know thus far before we go ahead and get started. And so what we're going to do to start is you're going to go ahead and get your clear mixing apparatus, if you will. Something that is clear is pretty crucial because we are going to be tracking how tall or short it is over the next couple of days. So you can see I have a little mason jar and Miranda has a big mixing bowl. And you're also going to get out your measuring metric. So for me, it's going to be the scale, and for Miranda, it's going to be her measuring cup.
My measuring cup.
Yeah, and so like we said before, there's really only 2 simple ingredients, which is water and flour. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with that. And do any of you guys at home know anything about bread? No. Miranda, what about you? What about your background?
So I actually wasn't really sure what a sourdough starter was at first because all the recipes, I looked at used yeast. But I do have a friend who's like you, can be really into baking. And so she made her own starter. And when we were on FaceTime, she was showing me how she could feed her starter. And she was talking about how it was like a live culture, almost like your pet yeast. So I thought that that was really interesting, and it'll definitely be fun to try that today.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you guys who don't even know what starter is, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys my starter. This is our home batch of starter, and you can see that there are lots of little bubbles, and it's basically, it kind of looks like a bread dough itself, just much more simplified. And so this is what you guys are going to be able to create over this next week. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I think one of the hallmarks of a starter is all these little bubbles. And do any of you guys at home know what these bubbles might be? If you do, go ahead and put it in the chat. And Miranda, you told us that the yeast was almost alive. Does that have anything to do with the bubbles?
Yes. So actually, I have my sister's experiment from class here of yeast. And so essentially in this bottle with the blown up balloon, there's yeast, flour, water, and sugar. And so because yeast is alive, it breaks down this sugar, which is sort of its food, to create carbon dioxide. So that's why this balloon is broken up. And then in this bottle, there's no sugar, so the yeast has to go under lactic acid fermentation, and it'll take a while for it to produce carbon dioxide, which is why the balloon isn't blown up. So that's also, lactic acid fermentation is a process that our bodies undergo too. Like when you're running and your muscles get very sore, it's because not enough oxygen can be supplied to your muscles. So your body's actually doing lactic acid fermentation, and the acid produced is what makes you sore.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a long-winded way of saying that the yeast are going to undergo fermentation and produce the carbon dioxide bubbles that you see in your starter. And these are also the bubbles, or I guess holes that you see in your bread, which make it as chewy and give it the good texture that it has.
Awesome, and that's so cool. And we're going to go ahead and start making our very own starter. And we're going to start with our two main ingredients. And like I said before, that is going to be your flour and water, your flour of choice. And what we're going to do is, if you have a scale like me, go ahead and turn it on and zero it out. And if you have some measuring cups, like Miranda, go ahead and get those out as well. And so what we're going to do first is take our water. And if you're doing it with a scale, you're going to try to get as close as you can to 100 grams. And if you're using a cup measure, it's simply just going to be around 1/3 cup. And you can see that I'm actually on the wrong units right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and switch those to grams, and I'm at 56 grams. And just like everything, so you really are trying to be as precise as possible so you can replicate your results as if this were your very own at-home science experiment. And so now that you have gotten your water laid out, what we're going to do is go ahead and add our flour mixture. Miranda, what kind of flour are you going to be using today?
So I'll be using all-purpose flour, which is, I guess, just your standard flour. And then for Kimi's flour, we'll be letting you guys pick between 3 options.
Yeah, and so those options are, I can also use all-purpose flour just like Miranda. I can also use some whole wheat flour, or I could even do a combination of half and half. So go ahead and let us know down in the chat which one you think I should use. And just as a little fun fact, there are infinite different types of bread. I know there are a lot of standards, and we're saying that this is a sourdough loaf, but even if we all follow the exact same recipe, there's going to be so much variation between all of our loaves. And that's because the flavor comes from the yeast, and there is wild yeast inside all of our flours, which is why when you use different types, they generally have different flavors. But there's also wild yeast in the air all around us. And as this starter grows over this next week, it's going to be taking in some of those wild yeast organisms from the air, and you'll be making your own starter that is completely unique to you because no one has the exact same environment as you do, which is really cool.
That's so cool. I love the idea that our yeast pets are kind of personalized to our homes.
Exactly. We each have our very own unique little yeast pet. And so I think for today, I'm going to go ahead. My personal favorite is using a little bit of half all-purpose and half whole wheat. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do for today. And what you want to remember is if you're doing this by weight like me, the golden ratio is 1 to 1. Super simple, no need to write anything down, just 1-to-1. However much water you have is how much flour you're gonna add. And so for me, since I have 100 grams of water, I'm gonna add 100 grams of flour total. But for those who are measuring by volume, it's gonna be a little different because the water, if you think about it, is a lot more compact. There's no air bubbles in between water, but with flour particles, there are lots of little air holes in between. So you're actually gonna have to add a little bit more flour than water by volume. So the golden ratio for those of you who are measuring it out is gonna be 1 part water to 2 part flour. So Miranda, what amount are you gonna be using for yourself?
Yeah, so since I used a 1/3 cup of water in my bowl, I'll be doing 2/3 cups of flour.
Yeah, and so we go ahead and measure this out. Again, if you're on a scale, you're going to want to zero it out again so that you're starting from scratch. And since I'm doing 2, I'm going to try to get 50 grams of each. And again, we're going to try to be as accurate as possible. And the reasons that these types of flours that we mentioned at the beginning, the all-purpose, the bread flour, the rye flour, and the whole wheat flour are the best for making starters is because they produce a really nice gluten structure. And Miranda, did you know anything about gluten structure?
I actually don't know that much, so I'd love if you could tell me more.
Yeah, so basically the gluten structure is just like all these little things that are making it more taut or giving it some structure in the bread dough. And that's what's going to be trapping all of that carbon dioxide that the yeast is letting out. And so while it's going to be trying to escape while you bake it in the oven, if there's a strong gluten structure, it'll be contained. And that's what keeps the bubbles inside the bread. Because if you start with bubbles, but your dough isn't strong enough to keep them in there, they're just going to escape. And then you're left with a lump of dough that, again, doesn't have any bubbles.
Right, and we do not want hard bread.
No, it would be very dense and it probably wouldn't be the best to eat. And so once you guys measure out your 100 grams or 2 cups of flour, or 2/3 cup of flour, it's going to be really simple from here. You're basically just going to mix it all up and combine it as much as you can. And you can see here on mine, this is what it'll look like at this stage. You should see that maybe there's a couple layers forming, and you're just going to go ahead and mix it as thoroughly as possible. And so basically all the yeast, like we've talked about, is kind of alive. And what you're really doing here is you're feeding it. And this is what we're also going to have to do throughout the next week. And so the yeast, if you think of them as like little animals, produce this enzyme. And enzymes basically just help reactions take place. And these are the enzymes that produce the carbon dioxide that make those little bubbles. But if you also think of it like we've been talking, how we also perform a lot of the same processes that the yeast does, you have to think that we need food, don't we? So why wouldn't the yeast? So that's basically what we're doing right now. We're giving it all the energy it needs to keep on producing and to keep on making those air bubbles that we want.
Awesome. And is your dough kind of stiff and hard to mix, Kimmy?
Yeah, so right now it should be pretty dough-like. It shouldn't be too liquidy. So make sure that you got all the ratios right. You can see here that it's kind of like a paste. And yeah, and so that's what it should look like right about now. And once you finish mixing it all up, check it, since you guys should be using something clear, just sort of check around it and check to see if you see any little white pockets, because those might be some pockets of flour. And we really want to make sure that all the little yeasts are getting all of the food that they need. And so once you're done with that, you're going to see that maybe when you mix it, you got a little bit up on the sides. But like I briefly mentioned earlier, we are going to be tracking the height of it. So make sure to try to smooth down all the sides, get the sides as clean as possible, and make it as sort of a flat as you can. Make it as even as possible. It doesn't have to be exact. It'll sort of settle down over the next couple of days naturally, but it's good to try to get the sides as clean as possible. And then once you guys are done with that, it's a pretty simple process from here on out. But Miranda, can we just use this right now as is and make a loaf of bread?
So we actually can't use it yet, which is why we decided to do this live event a week in advance. So our yeast isn't ready yet. So There's actually some upkeep that's required over this next week, and then we'll be able to use the starter together to make our own loaf of sourdough bread next week. So do you want to talk about what we have to do for the next couple of days, Kimi?
Yeah, of course. So this is actually like a little example I just wanted to show you guys. This is a starter that's about a day old. You can see that it's kind of like ours, just a little bit more settled down. And basically, not sure if you guys will be able to see, but there are little bubbles forming. And so that is one of the key things we're going to be looking for in the coming days are these little bubbles forming. And that means that the yeast is alive and it's happy and all the food that we've given it has been paying off. And so to keep it like that and keep it happy and growing and getting strong and developing that gluten structure, we're going to have to be feeding it throughout this next couple of days. So what we are going to be doing is we're going to be looking for signs of fermentation. And the 3 signs of fermentation are like bubbles, as you can see on screen. And the ones that I showed you are pretty small, so it's probably not quite ready, but you're looking for lots of bubbles, which shows lots of activity in the enzymes. You'll also start to smell something that's like a little bit of a funky, tangy smell, and that's where the sour and sourdough comes from. It comes from that tangy smell. And the last thing that you're going to be looking for is a rise in size. So it'll actually start to grow over time and it'll expand. You can see that on mine. I marked it with a piece of tape where it started yesterday, and you can see it's grown a little bit, even just in one day. And we're going to be looking for it to almost double in size. And so how we get it to that point is what we do is once we see all those signs of fermentation, which is probably either going to be tomorrow, maybe the day after, it all depends on your environment of your house. But what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be removing a lot of this starter and kind of discarding it to the side. And we're only going to be keeping about 25 grams. So just to recap, once you see all the signs of fermentation, the smell, the bubbles are probably the most important. So if you don't remember anything, remember bubbles. Remember, you got to see lots and lots of bubbles. And once you see that, you're only going to keep about 25 grams, which is about 2 tablespoons. And so with those 2 tablespoons, you're going to leave that in your jar, and the rest you're going to put to the side. And with that little bit that you saved, you're going to refeed it because it needs some more food and it needs to keep growing, just like we all do. And so what you're going to do is the exact same thing that we did today. You're going to add 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. And so with the addition of your little 2 original tablespoons. So remember that. You guys can go ahead and take a screenshot of the screen right now. And remember, if you guys are doing it by measuring cup, 100 grams of water is around 1/3 cup, and 100 grams of flour is around 2/3 cup. And you're actually going to repeat that. So every single time, check in every day. After the first couple of days, normally it's pretty strong and it'll keep on going pretty fast. And so every single time you see those signs of fermentation, roughly once a day, what you're going to have to do is refeed it. And you're going to keep on discarding a lot of that and only keeping that little.
All right. And so, Kimi, is there anything that we can do with the discarded starter, or does it just go to waste?
Of course, we definitely don't want any of this hard worked starter to go to waste, and there are tons of recipes out there to use it. The only reason that we don't keep it is because we want the very strongest and most like glutinous structures to go into our bread, because we need a really tight structure to keep all those air bubbles contained. But there are tons of recipes that don't need all of that structure. And if you just look up sourdough discard recipes, you can make pancakes. We've made pizza crust. We've made like banana breads and stuff like that. There's so many options. It's really unlimited out there. So definitely it won't ever have to go to waste.
Sounds really good.
Yeah, and so what we do to store it, and over this next couple of weeks, or this next week mostly, what we're going to be doing is giving it a nice, happy environment. And to do that, we're going to need to keep it nice and warm. And that's because enzymes have like an ideal environment where they work best, and for the yeast in bread, it's at a somewhat warm temperature. No need to blast it with heat because it'll actually end up killing the yeast, but it's just a nice, normal room temperature should be good. And this is all just going to factor into how fast you guys get those signs of fermentation. If your house is really warm, you guys might see your signs of fermentation tomorrow. If your house is a little bit on the cool side, it might take a couple more days. So just be patient and look for the signs of fermentation rather than going off by a number of days. And in addition to keeping it in a nice warm place, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cover it. And if you have a mason jar, you can find a lid and cover it, or you can also just use some cling wrap. And so the cling wrap or any type of top that you're using is basically just to keep the yeast and the starter from drying out too much. And so
Awesome.
cover it. And keep it nice and happy. And if you guys are wondering, after this first week, your starter is going to be way lower maintenance. You guys are not going to have to be feeding it every single day for the rest of your life. So this is really just for the first week. We're really just trying to get it strong, get it healthy. And then after that, what we can do is you can actually put it in your refrigerator at that point, and that will slow down the enzymes. They'll just move slower, and they won't produce as much carbon dioxide, but they also won't grow as fast. So you'll be able to use it over time, and it'll be able to be sustained longer in the fridge. But just to reiterate, we don't want to do that right at the beginning because then it doesn't quite get as strong as fast as we want it to.
Interesting. How old is your starter, Kimi?
My starter is probably from June. It's probably when he started.
Oh my goodness.
So that's probably how old ours is. And you can really keep your starter indefinitely. It'll keep on taking all those microorganisms from your air and continue to change the taste of your bread. So you might even see over time that even with the exact same starter and the exact same recipe, your bread might come out a little bit different every single time, which is super cool. And so now that we've covered it, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, just leave it aside for this next week. And we're going to come back next week and come and bake some bread together with our starter. And we might even do some other recipes if you guys request them. Miranda, did you have any other questions?
So I just keep feeding it over the next week. And why don't we test the chat on what the signs of fermentation are? So if you guys type them in, when do you know that you should start feeding your yeast again?
And so there should be 3 signs. And you guys can also explain why maybe we go by the signs of fermentation rather than the time.
Right. And so here's my starter that we made yesterday. It's 1 day old. So do you guys think that it's ready to be fed yet?
And then you guys can also compare that to this starter, like I said, that's from June, and you can see how many bubbles are in there.
Wow. It's very bubbly.
And even past the starter phase, there are so many different ways that you can customize your bread, and we'll be sort of going over those in future paths. I see in the chat that bubbles, perfect. That is probably the most important one, the one that really tells you when it's ready to go. And the other one, the kind of sour, tangy smell, exactly. Those are exactly the 2 things that you're looking for. Yeah, and so that one is going to be YT Brick Studios. Great job for pointing out the bubbles, and great job to VM for the smelling sour sort of smell. And the last thing that wasn't in the chat is going to be the rise, and it's actually going to grow over time. And so you can see that the one that I marked yesterday, like I said, with the tape, is just going to be growing a little bit. And so what you guys can go ahead and do at home as well is mark it either with a rubber band. If you're using something like a mason jar, the rubber band will stay. But if you guys are using something like a bowl, you might need to use some tape. And we're going to be looking for it to almost double in size. But again, the bubbles are probably the most important. And next week, we'll be going over how to actually test. There's a tricky little test that you can see if your starter is ready to go ahead and bake with.
Yeah, so we're super excited for everyone to take good care of their starter and bake with us in the future.
We look forward to seeing you guys next week and hope you guys have fun feeding your starter. Thanks, everyone.